I need people to understand something about what happened to me last summer in the Ozark National Forest. I'm 32, work as an electrician in Little Rock, and I've been hiking solo for about 8 years now. That Saturday in late June started like any other weekend trip. I'd driven out early, parked at a lesser-known trailhead about 40 miles from town, and planned to do a 15-mile loop through some backcountry sections that barely see any foot traffic. The heat was already building by 9 in the morning, that thick Arkansas humidity that makes your shirt stick to your back within minutes. I had my usual gear, lightweight pack, 2 liters of water, some jerky and trail mix, my GPS unit, and a small fixed-blade knife on my belt. The first few miles were peaceful, just me and the sound of cicadas screaming in the trees, the occasional rustling of squirrels, and my boots crunching on the dry pine needles that carpeted the trail. Around noon, I decided to veer off trail for a bit to check out a creek I could hear running somewhere below the ridge I was on. That's when everything went sideways. After bushwhacking down a steep slope for maybe 20 minutes, fighting through thorny vines and dodging spider webs, I pushed through a thick wall of mountain laurel and stumbled right into what looked like someone's camp. But this wasn't your typical backpacker's setup with ultralight gear and leave-no-trace ethics. There were at least 6 or 7 makeshift tents made from blue tarps and rope strung between trees, a fire pit still smoldering with fresh coals, clothes hanging on lines, and trash everywhere. Empty cans of beans, cigarette packs, and dozens of liquor bottles, mostly cheap whiskey and vodka, scattered around like someone had been throwing them after finishing. The smell hit me immediately. Unwashed bodies, rotting food, and something else underneath it all. Something chemical and sharp that made my nose burn. Against a large oak tree, I counted 4 rifles and what looked like 2 shotguns, just propped there casual as you please, along with several boxes of ammunition stacked on a piece of plywood. My first instinct was to back away slowly, get the hell out of there before whoever lived in this mess came back. These weren't homeless folks down on their luck. The firearms alone told me that much. I started taking careful steps backward, trying not to snap any twigs or rustle the undergrowth, when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. About 30 feet to my left, partially hidden behind a thick pine trunk, someone was standing perfectly still, watching me. It was a woman, maybe mid-40s, wearing a stained yellow tank top and cut-off jeans, her hair matted and hanging in greasy strands around her face. She didn't say anything, didn't move, just stared at me with this blank expression that made every hair on my arm stand up. I raised my hand in what I hoped was a friendly wave, tried to smile, and said something like, "Sorry, didn't mean to intrude. Just got turned around looking for the creek." She didn't respond, didn't even blink, and that's when I noticed more movement. To my right, behind me, all around the perimeter of the camp. They were everywhere. I counted at least 8 people, maybe more, all positioned between the trees like they'd been waiting there the whole time. Men and women of various ages, all dressed in worn, dirty clothes, all watching me with that same vacant stare. None of them spoke or made any aggressive moves. They just stood there, strategically placed to block every possible exit route I might take. The closest one to me was a skinny guy, probably early 20s, with a scraggly beard and a faded baseball cap, standing maybe 15 feet away next to a makeshift table made from an old door, balanced on cinder blocks. On that table, I could see plastic bags filled with something white, a digital scale, and what looked like burner phones lined up in a row. The chemical smell I'd noticed earlier suddenly made sense, and I felt my mouth go completely dry. These people weren't just squatting in the forest. They were cooking something out here, and I'd just walked right into the middle of their operation. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We all just stood there in this bizarre standoff while sweat rolled down my spine. Then, from behind one of the larger tents, an older man emerged. He was different from the others. Cleaner, wearing fresh clothes, a gray button-up shirt and dark jeans with actual leather boots instead of the raggedy sneakers everyone else had on. He had silver hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and walked with this confident stride that immediately marked him as the one in charge. He approached me slowly, stopping about 10 feet away, and when he smiled, I noticed he had all his teeth, white and straight, unlike the meth mouth situation I could see on some of the others. "You're pretty far off the trail, friend," he said, his voice calm and oddly pleasant, like we were chatting at a coffee shop instead of in the middle of nowhere with armed guards surrounding us. "GPS must have led you astray. Happens sometimes out here. These devices, they don't always account for the old trails, the ones that aren't on the official maps anymore." I tried to keep my voice steady as I agreed with him, explaining that yeah, I'd been following what I thought was a deer path down to the creek and must have gotten confused. He nodded along, still smiling, and then asked me where I'd parked, how long I'd been hiking, if anyone knew where I was today. The questions seemed casual, but I could feel the weight behind each one. He was trying to figure out if I was alone, if anyone would come looking for me. I lied and said my girlfriend was expecting me back by 5, that she had my GPS coordinates on her phone through one of those safety apps, that she'd already texted me twice asking for updates. His eyes narrowed slightly at that, and he pulled out an old flip phone from his pocket, checking something on it. "No cell service out here," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Haven't been for years. Tower companies don't bother with this section of the forest." My stomach turned to ice because he was right. I hadn't had a signal since about 2 miles from the trailhead, and we both knew it. He took a step closer, and I instinctively stepped back, which made him chuckle. "Relax, nobody here wants trouble. We're just a group of folks who prefer living off the grid, away from all the government oversight and surveillance. You understand that, don't you? Sometimes a man just needs his freedom." Behind him, I could see 2 more people emerging from tents, both carrying what looked like hunting rifles, though they kept them pointed at the ground. One of them, a heavy-set man with a thick red beard and a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, walked over to the table with the drugs and started casually packing things into a black duffel bag, never taking his eyes off me. The leader continued talking, his tone still friendly but with an edge creeping in. "Problem is, friend, you've seen our little community here. That puts us in an awkward position. We value our privacy, you see. Have to, considering how the world treats people like us who just want to be left alone. So now we need to figure out what to do about this situation." The woman in the yellow tank top had moved closer while he was talking, now standing maybe 8 feet away, and I could see her more clearly. Her arms were covered in scabs and scratches, some fresh, some healing, and her pupils were so dilated her eyes looked almost black. She kept scratching at her neck with dirty fingernails, leaving red marks on her skin, and mumbling something under her breath that I couldn't make out. The leader noticed me watching her and sighed. "Don't mind Julie. She's going through a rough patch, but we take care of our own here." He gestured around the camp with obvious pride. "Everyone here has a story, a reason they can't be part of regular society anymore. Some got pushed out, some chose to leave. But we've built something here, a real community. We look out for each other, share what we have, protect what's ours." His hand moved to rest on his hip, pushing back his shirt just enough for me to see the grip of a pistol tucked into his waistband. "And we're very, very good at protecting what's ours." I knew I had to get out of there, but running would be suicide. They knew this terrain. They were armed, and they had me surrounded. So I tried to play it cool, told him I understood completely, that I was just a hiker who took a wrong turn and had no interest in anyone's business. I even made up a story about my own brother getting hassled by the cops for living in an RV, trying to build some kind of connection. The leader listened, tilting his head like he was considering my words, then looked around at his people. Some kind of silent communication passed between them, nods and gestures I couldn't interpret. Finally, he turned back to me and said, "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk with me and my associate here." He pointed to the red-bearded man who'd finished packing the duffel bag. "And we're going to escort you back to the main trail. You're going to forget you ever saw this place. You're going to forget these faces, forget this conversation. Because if you don't, if we see any cops sniffing around here or rangers or anyone asking questions, well..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the red-bearded man made a throat-cutting gesture that was crystal clear. "They made me empty my pockets first, took my phone, my GPS unit, even my little digital camera I had clipped to my pack strap. The leader scrolled through my phone's photos while the red-bearded guy checked my GPS history, making sure I hadn't marked any waypoints near their camp. "Clean," the big man grunted, and they gave everything back except the GPS. "That stays with us," the leader said. "Consider it a small price for your education today." Then we started walking, the leader in front, me in the middle, and the red-bearded man behind me with his rifle now cradled in his arms. The rest of the group stayed at the camp, but I could feel their eyes on us until the trees swallowed us up. We walked in silence for about 20 minutes, pushing through thick undergrowth, following no trail I could see. The leader moved through the forest like he'd been doing it his whole life, never hesitating, never checking a compass. Behind me, I could hear the red-bearded man's heavy breathing and the occasional grunt when he had to duck under a low branch. When we finally reached what the leader called the main trail, though it looked like just another barely visible path to me, he stopped and turned to face me. "Your car's that way," he said, pointing north. "About 3 miles. Should take you an hour if you move quick." He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "I want to be very clear about something. We know what you look like now. We know your name from your license in your wallet. We know you're from Little Rock. If anything happens to disturb our peace here, we'll know who to thank for it. And friend, you do not want that. We have people in town, people who can find anyone, anywhere. This forest is our home, and we protect our home with extreme prejudice," the red-bearded man added. "Saw your parking pass too. Nice blue Ford pickup, Arkansas plates ending in 472. Be a shame if something happened to it on one of those dark city streets." The threat was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that it hit harder than if they'd been screaming at me. The leader gave me one last smile, that same unsettling, friendly expression from before, and said, "You seem like a smart man. Smart men know when to keep their mouths shut. Don't make us regret letting you walk away." Then they turned and melted back into the forest, moving so quietly I lost sight of them within seconds, even though I was staring right at where they'd gone. I stood there for a full minute, making sure they were really gone before I started hiking north as fast as I could without actually running. Those 3 miles felt like 30, and I kept looking back, expecting to see them following me. But there was nothing but trees and shadows. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, intact and alone in the small gravel parking area, I nearly cried with relief. I drove straight home, didn't stop for gas or food or anything. Just white-knuckled it all the way back to Little Rock. And you know what? I never reported it. Never told the cops, never told the rangers, never even told my family. It's been 4 months now and I still check my rearview mirror constantly. Still get jumpy when I see a blue tarp or smell that chemical smell. I know those people are still out there, cooking their drugs and living their twisted version of freedom. But I also know they were dead serious about their threats. Sometimes keeping quiet isn't about being a coward. It's about being smart enough to know when you're completely outmatched. Last fall, I was 24 and working at an outdoor equipment store in Colorado, spending most weekends exploring trails with my coworkers. We were all pretty experienced hikers, the kind of people who'd rather spend Saturday morning on a mountain than sleeping in. That particular October day started like any other adventure. Me, my coworker Jason, his girlfriend Melissa, and our friend Connor decided to check out a lesser-known trail system about 2 hours from Denver. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air with golden aspens everywhere, and we'd packed enough supplies for a solid 8-mile loop that was supposed to take us through some beautiful backcountry. I remember joking with Connor about how we'd probably only see deer and maybe some wild turkeys. Nothing more exciting than that. We had no idea what we were about to walk into, or how fast a perfect hiking day could turn into something that still makes me check my rearview mirror whenever I drive through wooded areas. About 3 miles into the hike, Jason spotted what looked like an old logging road branching off from the main trail, barely visible through the overgrown brush and fallen leaves. We weren't in any rush, had plenty of daylight left, and Jason was convinced it might lead to an old mine or cabin. Colorado's full of abandoned stuff like that from the mining days. The path was rough, clearly hadn't been used in years. With thick undergrowth scratching at our legs and low-hanging branches, we had to duck under every few feet. After maybe 15 minutes of pushing through this mess, we came into a small clearing where the trees opened up just enough to let in patches of sunlight. Right there in the middle, partially hidden by tall grass and surrounded by rusted beer cans and old campfire remains, was this beat-up white van, probably from the early 2000s based on the shape. The thing looked like it had been there for months at least. The tires were deflated, windows were covered in dirt and pine needles, and rust was eating through the wheel wells. But what caught our attention was that the back doors were slightly open, just a few inches, like someone had tried to close them but they wouldn't latch properly. Connor made some joke about finding a serial killer's hideout, and we all laughed nervously, but curiosity got the better of us. Melissa stayed back a few feet while Jason, Connor, and I approached the van, our hiking boots crunching on broken glass and old leaves. The smell hit us before we even got close. This thick, musty combination of mildew, rotting fabric, and something else I couldn't quite place, like metal mixed with something organic. Jason reached the back doors first and used a stick to push them open wider, the hinges screaming like they hadn't moved in forever. What we saw inside made us all take a step back at the same time. The floor of the van was covered in women's belongings: purses, shoes, jewelry, cell phones, all different styles and sizes, like they'd been collected from different people. But that wasn't the worst part. Bolted to the walls were these heavy-duty metal restraints, the kind you'd see in a prison transport vehicle, with thick chains attached. There were dark stains on the floor beneath them that I didn't want to think too hard about. Melissa whispered that we needed to call the police immediately, and she was absolutely right, but none of us had cell service this deep in the woods. Connor was already backing away, saying we should get back to the main trail and find help, when we heard it, the distinct sound of branches breaking somewhere behind us, not like an animal moving through the brush, but deliberate, heavy footsteps. We all went completely still. Even our breathing seemed too loud in that moment. The footsteps were getting closer, coming from the direction we'd hiked in from, cutting off our path back to the main trail. Jason grabbed a large rock, Connor pulled out his pocket knife, and I picked up a thick branch, though I knew none of these would do much good if whoever was coming meant trouble. Melissa had her phone out, recording everything even though we couldn't call anyone, her hands trembling as she held it up. The footsteps stopped maybe 30 feet away, just beyond where we could see through the thick trees and undergrowth. Then we heard whistling, this slow, casual tune like someone taking a leisurely walk, completely out of place in that terrifying moment. A man's voice called out, friendly and warm, "Hey there, folks. Didn't expect to run into anyone out here." "You lost?" The normalcy of his tone made it somehow worse. Jason squeezed my arm and pointed with his eyes to a small deer path leading uphill to our right. If we needed to run, that was our only option. The whistling started again, getting closer, and then he stepped into view. He was probably in his 50s, wearing faded jeans and a flannel shirt, looking like any regular guy you'd pass at a gas station. He had this genuine-looking smile, laugh lines around his eyes, and was carrying a backpack and what looked like a fishing rod. But his boots, I'll never forget this. His boots had fresh mud on them, really fresh, even though it hadn't rained in weeks and the ground here was bone dry. He glanced at the van and his expression shifted for just a second, this flash of something else before the friendly mask came back. "Oh, you found my old project," he said, walking closer, positioning himself between us and both the logging road and the deer path Jason had spotted. "Been meaning to haul that piece of junk out of here for years. Bought it at an auction. Thought I'd fix it up for camping, but you know how it goes." His explanation came too quick, too rehearsed, like he'd practiced it. Connor, trying to play along, said something about how we were just exploring and should probably head back. The man's smile widened, but his eyes stayed flat and unblinking. "Where you folks parked? I know these woods like the back of my hand, could show you a shortcut." He set down his fishing rod against a tree, and I noticed his right hand stayed in his jacket pocket, gripping something. Melissa had lowered her phone, but I could see it was still recording. The man noticed it too, his jaw tightening slightly. "That's quite a phone you got there, miss. They work out here? Mine never does." The way he said it wasn't really a question. That's when Jason did something brilliant. He suddenly doubled over, groaning and clutching his stomach, saying he thought he was going to be sick from something he ate at breakfast. It was so unexpected that even the man took a step back, his hand coming out of his pocket empty as he moved away from Jason's potential vomit zone. In that split second of distraction, Connor grabbed Melissa's hand and shouted, "Run!" We scattered in different directions. Connor and Melissa took the deer path uphill. Jason bolted straight into the thick woods to the left, and I ran back toward the van, then veered right, crashing through the undergrowth. Behind me, I heard the man curse loudly, his friendly act completely gone, followed by heavy footsteps. He was chasing someone, but I couldn't tell who. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode as I tore through branches that ripped at my clothes and face, jumping over fallen logs, skidding on loose rocks. I could hear shouting behind me, multiple voices now, which meant at least some of my friends were still running too. After what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, I burst out onto what looked like another old logging road, wider than the first one. My legs were shaking and my lungs burned, but I kept moving, jogging now instead of full sprinting. That's when I heard Connor's voice calling my name from somewhere to my left. I followed the sound and found him and Melissa hiding behind a massive fallen tree, both of them scratched up and breathing hard. Melissa was crying but still had her phone clutched in her hand. We waited there, listening for any sound of pursuit, for what must have been 5 minutes before Jason came crashing through the brush from a completely different direction, his shirt torn and blood running down his arm from a deep scratch. He'd lost the man by going through a creek bed and doubling back. We didn't stop to celebrate our reunion. We just started moving, staying together this time, following the logging road which eventually, miraculously, connected to an actual Forest Service road with trail markers. It took us another 2 hours of half running, half speed walking before we finally reached the parking area where Connor's truck was waiting, untouched. The second we had cell service, Melissa called 911 while Connor started the truck, ready to leave immediately if needed. The dispatcher kept us on the line, asking detailed questions about the location, the van, the man's description, everything we could remember. Within 20 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived at the parking area to take our statements, and they called in more units to search for the van. We showed them the video Melissa had taken. Her phone had captured the interior of the van clearly, including the restraints and the scattered belongings, plus about 10 seconds of the man before she lowered it. One of the deputies, an older woman with graying hair, watched the footage and immediately got on her radio, calling for additional backup and mentioning something about connecting this to the other cases. That phrase made my whole body go cold. She wouldn't tell us what other cases, just said detectives would be in touch and we needed to go to the station to give formal statements. We spent the next 4 hours at the sheriff's station, each in separate rooms, going over every detail again and again with different officers and detectives. They had us look through photo lineups, asking if we recognized anyone, but the man from the woods wasn't in any of them. A detective named Brennan finally told us that 3 women had gone missing from trails in that general area over the past 18 months, all experienced hikers who'd vanished without a trace. The belongings we'd seen in the van matched descriptions of items the missing women had with them. By the time they let us leave, it was past midnight, and they gave us each a business card with a case number, telling us not to discuss the details with anyone except law enforcement while the investigation was active. They also mentioned that they'd found the location we described, but the van was gone. Just tire tracks in the dirt, and some scattered trash remained. The man had moved at some time during our escape, which meant he'd gone back while we were running, calm enough to drive that van out of there despite knowing we'd seen everything. The investigation went on for months, and Detective Brennan stayed in touch, calling occasionally with follow-up questions or to show us new photos of potential suspects, but nothing ever came of it. They found the van 2 weeks later, burned out in a ravine about 50 miles away, completely destroyed along with any evidence it might have contained. The man we encountered was never identified or caught. Those 3 missing women are still missing. What haunts me most is how normal he seemed at first, how he could have been anybody. A neighbor, someone behind you in line at the grocery store, a friendly hiker sharing the trail. Jason ended up quitting his job and moving to Arizona, said he couldn't handle being around forests anymore. Melissa and Connor broke up a few months later. She told me once that every time she looked at him, she remembered that day, and it was too much. We all dealt with it differently, but none of us ever went hiking together again. I still live in Colorado, still work at the same store, but I haven't been on a trail since that October day. Sometimes customers ask me for recommendations about that particular area, and I always steer them somewhere else, anywhere else. The police asked us not to share specific details about the case publicly, and I've honored that. Changed some minor things here to protect the investigation, but I needed to tell someone the real story. Last month, Detective Brennan called to tell me there had been another disappearance, this time from a trail about 30 miles from where we'd been. Same pattern. Experienced female hiker vanished without a trace. Car found at the trailhead with everything still inside. She asked if I'd be willing to look at some new photos, maybe help with a sketch artist, and I agreed, but I knew it wouldn't matter. That man is still out there, probably with a different van now, maybe in a different state, still whistling that same casual tune while he hunts. If you're reading this and you love hiking like I used to, please just remember, if you ever find something in the woods that shouldn't be there, don't investigate. Don't let curiosity win. Just run. Run and don't stop until you're safe, because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some monsters look just like everyone else. The weekend started like any other hiking trip I'd taken with my college buddies. It was early May 2018, right after finals week at Oregon State, and the 4 of us, me, Brandon, Kevin, and Josh, decided we needed to decompress in the mountains. I was 22 then, working part-time at a sporting goods store while finishing my environmental science degree. We'd booked this rustic cabin near Mount Hood through some sketchy website that Josh found, mainly because it was dirt cheap and had decent reviews. The place sat about 3 miles from the nearest trailhead, surrounded by nothing but Douglas firs and the occasional deer path. We figured it would be perfect for disconnecting from everything. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just us, our backpacks full of beer and trail mix, and whatever card games we remembered to bring. The first day was exactly what we needed. We hiked about 8 miles on the Pacific Crest Trail, took photos at every scenic overlook, and made it back to the cabin around sunset, exhausted but satisfied. The cabin itself was smaller than the photos suggested. Basically 1 main room with 2 bunk beds, a kitchenette that hadn't been updated since the 70s, and a bathroom where you had to jiggle the toilet handle just right to make it stop running. But honestly, after sleeping in tents for most of our camping trips, having 4 walls and a roof felt like luxury. We cooked burgers on the ancient propane stove, played poker using pretzel sticks as chips, and Brandon told the same story about his ex-girlfriend that he'd been telling since freshman year. By 11 o'clock, we were all ready to crash, our legs sore from the hike, and our stomachs full of cheap beer and junk food. Around midnight, I woke up needing to pee. Probably shouldn't have had that 4th beer. The cabin was pitch black except for the green glow from Josh's fitness watch on the nightstand. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, trying not to wake anyone as I navigated between the backpacks and hiking boots scattered across the floor. That's when I heard it. Heavy footsteps on the wooden deck outside. Not the light patter of a raccoon or the quick movements of a deer, but deliberate, measured steps, like someone walking slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. I stood there in my boxers, phone in hand, listening as the footsteps moved from the front deck toward the side where our bedroom window was. They'd take 3 or 4 steps, then stop for maybe 10 seconds, then continue. The boards creaked under the weight. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. Kevin must have heard it too because I saw him sit up in the bottom bunk across from me. We made eye contact in the dim light, and he mouthed, "What the hell?" I shrugged, but my chest was already tightening with that primal feeling you get when something's genuinely wrong. The footsteps continued their circuit around the cabin, pausing at each window. I crept over to the front window and carefully moved the curtain aside just an inch. In the moonlight, I could make out a figure, tall, wearing what looked like a dark jacket and jeans, standing about 10 feet from the cabin, just staring at the building. He wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything really, just standing there with his arms at his sides. After maybe 30 seconds, he turned and walked toward the tree line, disappearing into the shadows between the massive fir trees. We woke Brandon and Josh, whispering about what we'd seen. Josh, always the skeptic, insisted it was probably just another hiker who got lost, or maybe the property owner checking on the cabin. But Brandon pointed out what we were all thinking. Who the hell checks on a rental cabin at midnight by walking circles around it and staring through windows? We decided to barricade the door with the heavy wooden dresser, which made an awful scraping sound against the floor that seemed to echo in the silence. Josh grabbed the cast iron skillet from the kitchen. Kevin found a hiking pole, and Brandon clutched his pocket knife like it was a sword. I had my phone ready to call 911, even though we all knew there was no signal. We sat there in the dark, 4 grown men huddled together like kids at a sleepover, listening to every sound outside, every branch that moved in the wind, every pine cone that fell on the roof. For about an hour, nothing happened. We started to relax a little, making nervous jokes about how we'd tell this story later, how we'd probably scared ourselves over some drunk local or a confused park ranger. Josh even suggested we were being paranoid and should move the dresser back. Then the doorknob turned. Not a violent twist, but slow and deliberate, like someone testing if it was locked. The handle jiggled once, twice, then stopped. We heard footsteps on the deck again, heavier this time, less careful. They walked to the window on the left side of the door, the one we hadn't covered with curtains because it faced the woods. A face appeared in the glass, hands cupped around the eyes to see inside better. The guy was probably in his 40s, with a scraggly beard and a baseball cap pulled low. He pressed his forehead against the window, scanning the dark room, and even though we were all frozen in place, I swear he was looking right at us. The man disappeared from the window and everything went quiet for maybe 5 minutes. We could hear our own breathing, Brandon's knuckles cracking as he gripped his knife tighter, the old refrigerator humming in the corner. Then came a sound that made my whole body go rigid, the screech of metal on metal from the back of the cabin. Kevin whispered that there was a tool shed attached to the rear wall, and the owner had mentioned something about maintenance equipment being stored there. We heard rustling, things being moved around, and then footsteps returning to the front of the cabin. This time, he didn't test the doorknob. Instead, we heard a solid thunk against the door, then another. He was using something heavy, maybe a crowbar or a hammer, working at the lock. The old wooden door frame started splintering with each hit, little pieces of painted wood falling onto the floor inside. Josh didn't wait for the door to give way. He started yelling at the top of his lungs, "We've called the police, they're on their way, get the hell out of here," which was a complete lie but seemed worth trying. The pounding stopped for a second, and we heard the man's voice for the first time, rough and slurred like he'd been drinking. "Ain't no police coming out here, boys. Just want to talk. Open up." The way he said boys made my skin prickle. He'd been watching us long enough to know we were young men. Not a family, not a couple. Brandon started recording a video on his phone, thinking maybe we'd need evidence later, while Kevin grabbed the fire extinguisher from beside the stove. The pounding resumed, harder now, and we could see the door frame starting to buckle. The deadbolt was holding, but the wood around it was cracking, splitting along the grain with each impact. When the door finally gave way, it happened fast. The frame splintered completely and the door swung inward, slamming against the dresser we'd pushed in front of it. The dresser held, but there was now a gap of about 8 inches between the door and the frame. The man's arm reached through, trying to push the dresser aside, his dirty fingers grasping at air. Kevin didn't hesitate. He aimed the fire extinguisher at the gap and let loose, filling the doorway with white chemical foam. The man yanked his arm back, coughing and cursing, stumbling backward on the deck. That gave us maybe 10 seconds. Josh and I threw our weight against the dresser, trying to push it back against the broken door, while Brandon grabbed his backpack and started pulling out anything we could use. A camping hatchet he'd brought for splitting kindling, a length of rope, even a can of bear spray he'd insisted on packing despite everyone making fun of him for it. The man came back angrier, wiping foam from his face with his sleeve. He kicked at the door, sending the dresser sliding back another few inches despite our weight against it. Through the gap, I could see him clearly now. Weathered face, wild eyes, wearing a flannel shirt with reflective strips like construction workers wear. He wedged the crowbar into the gap and started prying, using his whole body weight as leverage. The dresser scraped across the floor inch by inch. Kevin sprayed him again with the extinguisher, but it was running low, producing more of a weak mist than a strong blast. That's when Brandon made his move. He lunged forward with the bear spray, stuck his hand through the gap, and emptied the entire can directly into the man's face. The scream that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard, primal and enraged. The man fell backward off the deck, clutching his face, rolling on the ground. We used those moments to reinforce our barricade. Josh and I flipped the kitchen table and wedged it against the dresser, while Kevin grabbed the bunk bed mattresses to stack against the windows. Brandon stood guard at the door gap with the hatchet, ready to swing if the man tried to reach through again. We could hear him outside, still moaning, stumbling around, knocking things over. Then we heard something that gave us hope. Sirens in the distance. Turns out Josh's phone had managed to send an emergency SOS when he'd tried calling 911 earlier. Even without cell service, some phones can still ping emergency satellites, and apparently his had gotten through. The sirens grew louder, and we saw red and blue lights filtering through the trees. The man must have heard them too, because we heard him crash through the underbrush, heading deeper into the woods. By the time 2 sheriff's deputies arrived, weapons drawn and flashlights sweeping the area, he was gone. The deputies took our statements, examined the damaged door, and called for backup to search the woods. One of them, Deputy Ramirez, recognized our description of the man immediately. His name was Carl Dietrich, a local who'd been fired from his job at a logging company 3 months earlier. Since then, he'd been living rough in the forest, and there had been several reports of him watching hikers from the trees, following people on trails, and breaking into empty cabins. They'd been looking for him for weeks. They found him about 2 hours later, hiding in a drainage pipe about a mile away, still partially blind from the bear spray. We spent the rest of the night giving statements at the sheriff's station, drinking terrible coffee from paper cups. They told us Carl had a history of mental illness and substance abuse, and losing his job had sent him into a spiral. He'd been stalking hiking groups for weeks, but we were the first ones he'd actually tried to confront. The detective said we did everything right, stayed together, fought back, and most importantly, didn't let him inside where he could have cornered us. We drove home that morning in complete silence, everyone processing what had happened. I haven't been camping since. I need to get this out there because the park rangers, the police, nobody wants to talk about what happened to my brother Nathan last September. I'm a high school biology teacher in Montana. Been teaching for about 7 years now. And I've always been the rational one in my family. Nathan was 29, worked as a physical therapist at a clinic downtown, and had this thing about hiking solo every weekend to decompress from dealing with patients all week. He'd been doing these solo hikes for maybe 3 years, always sending me photos from whatever trail he was on, usually terrible selfies with his goofy grin and whatever wildlife he spotted in the background. That Saturday in September started like any other weekend for him, except this time he chose Glacier National Park, specifically the Highline Trail because he'd heard the mountain goats were really active that time of year. The last text I got from Nathan was at 8:47 a.m. Just a photo of the trailhead sign with the caption, "Starting out, should be back by 4." He was wearing his bright orange jacket, the one our mom bought him specifically so he'd be visible to hunters, even though hunting wasn't allowed in the park. I remember joking with him the night before about how he looked like a traffic cone in that thing, and he laughed saying at least the search and rescue team would spot him easily if he twisted an ankle. The trail he picked was one of the most popular in the park, especially on a Saturday morning in early fall, when the weather was perfect, about 65 degrees with clear skies. There must have been at least 40 other hikers who started that same trail within an hour of Nathan, based on what the rangers told us later. The parking lot was nearly full when he arrived, and several people remembered seeing him because of that orange jacket, stretching by his blue Toyota pickup, adjusting his backpack straps, doing his usual pre-hike routine. Around 2 p.m. I got a weird feeling in my chest, like when you're taking a test and suddenly realize you studied the wrong chapter. I tried calling Nathan just to check in, which wasn't something I normally did during his hikes, but the call went straight to voicemail. I figured he was in a dead zone, happens all the time in the mountains, so I left a stupid message about remembering to bring me one of those Huckleberry energy bars from the gift shop. By 5 p.m., when he hadn't texted that he was back at his truck, I started getting concerned. Nathan was obsessive about letting me know when he finished a hike, ever since that time 3 years ago when he forgot to check in and our mom called the rangers. By 6 p.m., I was calling the park service myself, trying not to sound like an overreacting family member, explaining that my brother was experienced but always checked in, and this wasn't like him at all. The initial search started that evening, just a couple of rangers driving the road and checking the parking areas. Nathan's truck was still there, locked, with his wallet tucked under the passenger seat where he always left it. They figured maybe he'd twisted an ankle and was slowly making his way back. Happens more often than you'd think. But then this couple, the Andersons from Wisconsin, came forward with something that made everyone pause. They'd been hiking back around 1:30 p.m. and saw Nathan about 3 miles in, standing beside the trail next to a massive Douglas fir tree. Mrs. Anderson remembered specifically because Nathan had helped them take a photo at a scenic overlook about 10 minutes earlier, and she'd commented on his jacket, saying her grandson had the same one. When they passed him by that tree, he was just standing there, his backpack on the ground beside him, looking up into the branches like he was watching something. Mr. Anderson had asked if everything was okay, and Nathan had turned, given them this huge smile, and said, "Just perfect, actually. Have a great hike." They thought it was weird that he was stopped in such a random spot, not a viewpoint or anything special, just a regular stretch of trail, but figured maybe he'd seen a bird or something. The full search began at dawn on Sunday with 20 volunteers, 3 dog teams, and a helicopter. I drove through the night from Montana to join them, running on gas station coffee and pure adrenaline. The search coordinator, a woman named Ranger Fielding who'd been doing this for 15 years, walked me through their grid pattern, showed me on the topographic map where the Andersons had seen Nathan. She kept reassuring me that most missing hikers are found within the first 48 hours, usually dehydrated, but fine. The dogs picked up Nathan's scent immediately from his truck and followed it precisely to that exact spot by the Douglas fir, 3 miles in. Then nothing. Not a single trace beyond that tree. The lead dog handler, this gruff guy named Tom who barely spoke except to his German shepherd, walked that same circle around the tree maybe 50 times, watching his dog's reaction. The dog would track right up to where the backpack was found, sit down and whine, pawing at the ground like the scent just evaporated into thin air. What they found at that spot still makes my skin prickle whenever I think about it. Nathan's backpack was placed, not dropped, but carefully placed against the base of the tree, standing upright with all the zippers closed. His phone was in the side pocket, still on, battery at 47%, with perfect signal, 4 bars. His water bottles were full, his lunch untouched, his emergency whistle still clipped to the shoulder strap. But here's the detail that nobody can explain. His hiking boots were inside the backpack. Not worn out, not damaged, just neatly placed inside with the socks tucked into them, like he'd carefully taken them off and packed them away. The ground around the tree was soft from recent rain 2 days before, should have shown clear footprints. But there was nothing. No bare footprints, no sign of anyone walking away from that spot. No disturbed vegetation, no broken branches. Rangers brought in tracking experts who could follow a week-old deer trail through solid rock, but they all came to the same conclusion. It was like Nathan just stopped existing at that exact spot. I stayed for 2 weeks, sleeping in my car at the trailhead parking lot because I couldn't leave. Every morning I'd hike to that tree, sometimes with search teams, sometimes alone, just staring at the spot, trying to understand. Other hikers would pass by, completely unaware they were walking through what had become a crime scene, though there was no crime anyone could identify. I started talking to everyone who'd been on the trail that day, became obsessed with finding someone, anyone who'd seen something after the Andersons. That's when I met Gregory Watts, a retired Forest Service employee who'd been hiking that same trail for 30 years. He hadn't seen Nathan, but when I described the exact location, his face went pale. He told me that in 1987, a woman named Carol Dunham had gone missing from that exact same spot. Same circumstances, backpack found neat and tidy, shoes inside, no tracks leading away. They never found her either. He said the old-timers who worked the park back then called it a quiet spot, wouldn't elaborate on what that meant, just said sometimes the forest chooses to keep someone. The investigation went on for months, but the official search was called off after 3 weeks. They brought in cadaver dogs, thermal drones, even some professor from the university with ground-penetrating radar. Nothing. Nathan's phone records showed no calls after my attempt at 2 p.m., but here's something that still bothers me. His phone's GPS showed him at that tree from 1:28 p.m. until 1:31 p.m. Then the location services just stopped updating. Not turned off, not lost signal, just stopped recording data while the phone stayed on. The FBI got involved briefly because of the bizarre circumstances, ran all these background checks thinking maybe Nathan had staged his own disappearance. But his bank accounts were untouched. His apartment was exactly as he'd left it, with dishes in the sink and laundry in the dryer. His passport was still in his desk drawer. The agent assigned to the case, Agent Coleman, told me off the record that in 40 years of missing persons cases, she'd never seen anything like it. She said usually there's something, a mistake, a clue, some tiny detail that doesn't fit. But with Nathan, everything was perfectly wrong in a way that made no logical sense. 4 months after Nathan disappeared, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a woman named Janet Holloway, who said she'd been following Nathan's case online and needed to talk to me. She drove 8 hours from Idaho to meet me at a diner near the park. Janet's daughter Rebecca had vanished on a popular trail in Yellowstone in 2016, same exact scenario. Backpack found perfectly arranged, shoes inside, phone still powered on, no tracks. But Janet had something else, something the authorities had dismissed. 3 days before Rebecca disappeared, she'd called her mother, excited about meeting another hiker who'd told her about thin places in the wilderness, spots where experienced hikers sometimes felt an overwhelming urge to stop and just step through. Rebecca had laughed it off as New Age nonsense, but she'd mentioned the hiker had specifically warned her to never take her shoes off if she felt that urge, that it was like an invitation. Janet had 23 cases she'd compiled over the past 5 years, all with the same pattern, all in different parks across the country. Every single one had their shoes removed and carefully stored. The part that haunts me most came from Nathan's co-worker, Bradley, who called me about 6 months later. He'd been cleaning out Nathan's desk at the clinic and found a notebook Nathan used for patient notes. But the last 3 pages weren't about patients. Starting 2 weeks before his hike, Nathan had been writing about these vivid dreams, where he was walking through a forest that looked exactly like the trails he hiked, except everything was slightly shifted. trees growing at impossible angles, paths that curved upward into the air, and this persistent feeling that someone was walking beside him, matching his steps perfectly but always just outside his peripheral vision. In the last entry, dated the night before his hike, he wrote, "The footsteps are getting louder. They sound exactly like mine but delayed by half a second. Starting to think they're not following me. Starting to think they're waiting for me to catch up." Bradley thought Nathan might have been having some kind of breakdown, but I knew my brother. He was the most grounded, rational person I'd ever known. He would have told me if something was wrong. At least I thought he would have. Last month, almost a year after Nathan vanished, I went back to the trail one final time. I needed closure, even if it meant accepting I'd never understand what happened. I stood at that Douglas fir for hours, running my hands over the bark, sitting where his backpack had been found. Around noon, just as I was about to leave, I noticed something carved into the tree, about 7 feet up, partially hidden by new growth. It looked old, maybe decades old, but I could make out initials. CD. 1987, Carol Dunham. Above it, fresher but still weathered, RH 2016, Rebecca Holloway. My heart was pounding as I looked higher, and there it was, so fresh the sap was still sticky. NP 2024, Nathan Pierce. But Nathan never carved his initials into trees. He was obsessive about leaving no trace when hiking. I took photos, called the rangers immediately, but when they arrived 2 hours later with a forensics team, the carvings were gone. Not removed, not covered up, just gone like they'd never existed. The bark was smooth and untouched. They looked at me like I was having a breakdown, suggested grief counseling, but I know what I saw. I don't hike anymore. Can't bring myself to step onto any trail, no matter how popular or safe it seems. Sometimes I dream about Nathan, and he's always standing by that tree, his orange jacket bright against the green forest, waving at me like he's saying hello or goodbye. I can never tell which. The Andersons, that couple from Wisconsin, they reached out to me recently. Mrs. Anderson couldn't stop thinking about that smile Nathan gave them. Said it didn't seem like his usual expression from earlier when he'd helped with their photo. She said it looked like the smile of someone who'd just figured out the answer to a question they'd been asking their whole life. The investigation is officially still open, but I know they'll never find him. I think Gregory Watts was right about the forest choosing to keep someone, though I'll never understand why it chose Nathan. All I have left are his things, that orange jacket hanging in my closet, and the knowledge that somewhere, in some way I can't comprehend, my brother found whatever he was looking for on that trail. I just wish I knew if he meant to find it. The search dogs went absolutely insane when they reached that spot. Barking, whining, spinning in circles like they'd hit an invisible wall. And then nothing. Complete silence. 6 different K9 units, all trained in wilderness tracking, and every single one of them lost Ashley Carpenter's scent at the exact same patch of dirt, 40 feet from where we found her water bottle standing perfectly upright against a moss-covered log. I've been volunteering with search and rescue for 8 years now, seen dozens of missing hiker cases, but I've never witnessed anything like what happened in those woods last week. Ashley was my roommate's younger sister, 24 years old, fresh out of nursing school with a job lined up at Harborview Medical Center. She texted her mom a photo from the summit at 11:47 a.m. Big smile, peace sign, her distinctive red hiking boots visible at the bottom of the frame, and by 2 p.m. she'd vanished from a trail she'd hiked at least a dozen times before. The Cascade foothills in early August are packed with hikers, especially on weekends, and the Granite Lake Loop Ashley chose that Saturday morning is basically a highway of outdoor enthusiasts. 5 miles total, moderate difficulty, with wooden bridges over the creeks and signs at every junction telling you exactly how far to the parking lot. When Ashley didn't show up for her 7 p.m. shift at the hospital, her supervisor immediately called her emergency contact. Her car, a beat-up Subaru with nursing textbooks still visible in the back seat, was sitting right there in the trailhead parking lot where she'd left it. Her hiking permit was filled out correctly, displayed on the dashboard, listing her expected return time as 4 p.m. The first search teams deployed within 2 hours of the missed shift call, and I joined them the next morning, thinking we'd find her with a twisted ankle somewhere just off the trail, embarrassed but safe. Day 2 changed everything. Around 11 a.m., Frank, a veteran search volunteer with silver hair and knees that clicked when he walked, spotted something blue about 300 yards off the main trail, down a steep embankment covered in devil's club and blackberry thorns. Ashley's water bottle, that expensive insulated kind everyone in Seattle seems to own, was standing perfectly upright against a decomposing log, not a scratch on it, the ice inside still partially frozen after 36 hours in the woods. Her initials, AMC, were etched into the bottom with what looked like a wood-burning tool, and there was still about half the water left inside. The placement bothered everyone immediately. You don't carefully set your water bottle down if you're injured or panicking, and you definitely don't leave it behind on purpose. 20 feet away, tangled in the low branches of a hemlock tree like someone had thrown it, we found her purple Columbia rain jacket, the lightweight kind that folds into its own pocket. That's when they brought in the dogs, 6 different teams from 3 counties, including this legendary bloodhound named Duke, who'd found a lost kid in a snowstorm 2 winters ago. The handlers started them at Ashley's car, let them get the scent from her sleeping bag she always kept in the trunk, and watched them work their way up the trail. Every single dog followed the exact same path, main trail to the 2-mile marker, sharp left onto a deer track barely visible through the ferns, straight down to where we'd found her gear. But here's where it gets genuinely disturbing. At a seemingly random spot about 40 feet from her water bottle, every dog just stopped. Not gradually losing the scent like what happens when rain washes it away or too many people contaminate the area. They hit that spot and reacted like they'd walked into a wall, some backing up, others sitting down and refusing to move forward. Duke actually started howling in this deep, mournful way that made everyone stop talking. The search coordinator, a woman named Diane who'd been doing this for 15 years, had us form a grid pattern from that spot where the dog stopped. We were literally shoulder to shoulder, moving through the underbrush inch by inch, checking every hollow log, every depression in the ground, every thick cluster of salal bushes. The terrain there was strange. Not quite a clearing, but not dense forest either, with these odd gaps between the trees where the canopy opened up in almost perfect circles. The ground was covered in this thick, spongy moss that made it hard to see if it had been disturbed, and underneath, the soil was dark and loamy, almost black. We found animal tracks, deer, raccoons, what looked like coyote, but no human footprints beyond that mysterious stopping point. The forensics team took soil samples, photographed everything, even brought in ground-penetrating radar, but the equipment kept malfunctioning, showing these weird readings that the operator said he'd never seen before, like the density of the earth kept changing every few feet. I need to tell you about Wednesday afternoon, because that's when things went from strange to genuinely frightening. We'd expanded the search radius to almost 2 miles from where her gear was found, and I was paired with this retired firefighter named George, who kept talking about how the birds were too quiet. He was right. Usually those woods are full of stellar jays and chickadees, but that day, it was like someone had hit a mute button on nature. We were checking this ravine that ran parallel to the trail when George grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises. About 50 feet below us, partially hidden by a massive root ball from a fallen cedar, there was what looked like fresh digging, not natural erosion or animal activity, deliberate human-sized excavation with the dirt piled neatly to one side. We called it in immediately, and within minutes the entire search team had converged on our location. They brought in an excavation team, approached it like a crime scene, everybody holding their breath while they carefully removed the soil. The hole was empty, but it wasn't just empty. It was precisely dug, about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet deep, with corners so sharp they looked machine-cut. The walls were smooth, compacted, like someone had spent hours perfecting them. At the bottom, pressed into the dirt, was a pattern of small indentations that the forensics photographer spent 20 minutes documenting from every angle. They looked almost like writing or symbols, but not quite. More like someone had pressed objects into the soil in a deliberate sequence. The smell coming from that hole was wrong too. Not decay or earth, but something chemical, like copper pennies mixed with antifreeze. While the forensics team worked, I noticed something else. Ashley's phone. It was tucked into a crevice in the root ball, screen cracked but still functional, battery at 12%. The last photo in her gallery wasn't the summit selfie she'd sent her mom. There were 17 more pictures after that, all taken between 1:47 and 1:53 p.m., and every single one was completely black. Diane had me look through the phone with her since I knew Ashley personally, hoping I might notice something important. The black photos had location data intact, all taken within a 100-foot radius of where we found the hole, but at different elevations, like she'd been moving up and down rapidly. Her last text conversation was with someone named Paul, a number not in her contacts from 3 days before her hike. The messages made no sense. Paul had sent her GPS coordinates, nothing else, and Ashley had responded with, "Confirmed for Saturday." When we checked, those coordinates led to a spot about a quarter mile from where the dogs lost her scent. The detective who'd joined the search by then ran Paul's number. It belonged to a burner phone purchased with cash at a gas station in Tacoma 2 weeks earlier, activated once to text Ashley, then never used again. The security footage from the gas station showed a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses, average height, average build, could have been anybody. He paid for the phone and a cup of coffee, kept his head down the entire time. Friday morning, day 6 of the search, brought the most disturbing discovery yet. A hiker not connected to our search party, some tourist from Ohio, had gotten lost and ended up in a section of woods we hadn't covered yet, about 3 miles from Ashley's last known location. He stumbled into the ranger station at Snoqualmie Pass, hyperventilating, saying he'd found what looked like a campsite, but wrong, all wrong. The rangers thought he was dehydrated and hallucinating until he showed them the photos on his phone. Hidden in a cluster of old-growth trees, someone had built what I can only describe as a blind, like what hunters use, but more elaborate. Tarps painted to match the forest colors, netting covered in real branches and moss, positioned to overlook 3 different trail junctions. Inside were maps of the entire trail system, with dates written next to certain locations. Ashley's name wasn't there, but there were 12 other names, all women between 20 and 30, with dates going back 2 years. Some names I recognized from missing person cases that had been ruled as accidents or voluntary disappearances. The investigation exploded after that discovery. FBI arrived within hours. The entire mountain was closed to the public, and they brought in specialized teams I'd never seen before. People in unmarked vans with equipment that looked military grade. They found more blinds, 7 total, all with similar setups and documentation. In one, they discovered notebooks filled with observations, hiking patterns, peak times for trail usage, detailed physical descriptions of regular hikers, their routines, when they hiked alone versus with groups. Ashley's name appeared in the most recent entries, along with notes about her Saturday hiking habit, her favorite trails, even mentions of her red hiking boots, and the fact that she always parked in the same spot. The handwriting analysis showed at least 3 different people had contributed to these notebooks over the years. They also found industrial-grade zip ties, lengths of rope pre-cut to specific measurements, and bottles of that same chemical smell we'd noticed at the hole, which turned out to be a veterinary anesthetic that can be absorbed through the skin. Here's what haunts me most about this whole thing. They never found Ashley, but they found the others. On day 8, cadaver dogs led teams to a section of forest about 5 miles from any official trail, an area so dense with undergrowth that you'd need machetes to get through. There was a natural depression in the land, hidden by a thick canopy and surrounded by devil's clubs so thick it formed an almost impenetrable barrier. Inside that depression, they found remains matching 8 of the 12 names from the notebooks, in various stages of decomposition. The forensic anthropologist said the oldest had been there approximately 18 months, the newest maybe 3 weeks. But Ashley wasn't among them. The FBI questioned everyone who'd been on those trails in the past month, pulled surveillance from every gas station and business within 50 miles, analyzed thousands of hours of dashcam footage from the area. They arrested 2 men whose DNA was found on items in the blinds. Both had records for minor crimes. Both claimed they'd been hired through encrypted messages to maintain the sites and document hikers, paid in cryptocurrency, never meeting their employers in person. The official search for Ashley was suspended after 2 weeks, though the criminal investigation continues. The men they arrested insist they never hurt anyone, that they were just paid to watch and report, that someone else, someone they never met, handled what they called the collections. They led investigators to drop sites where they'd leave their notebooks and receive payment, always remote locations with no cameras, always at night. Both men are facing conspiracy charges, but without bodies or direct evidence of violence, the prosecutors are struggling. Ashley's family hired private investigators who are still searching, following up on reported sightings that never pan out. Sometimes I drive up to those trails, now permanently closed, and stand at the fence they've erected. I think about how Ashley's scent just stopped, how those 17 black photos might have been her trying to document something in darkness, how someone watched her for weeks, knew her routines, planned everything meticulously. The worst part is knowing that whoever orchestrated this is still out there, probably already scouting new locations, watching new trails, picking new names to write in notebooks. And Ashley, whether she escaped, was taken, or met some other fate, remains as absent as her scent beyond that mysterious spot where even trained dogs couldn't follow. Teaching art to elementary school kids in a small Pennsylvania college town wasn't exactly thrilling at 27, but it paid the bills. Every day felt like a copy of the last one. Show up at 8, demonstrate how to mix tempera paints, help tiny hands cut construction paper, clean glue off desks, go home to my studio apartment, watch Netflix, sleep, rinse and repeat 5 days a week. The weekends were different though. For about 2 years, I'd been hiking solo every chance I got, driving out to different trails within a couple hours of town. No lesson plans, no sticky fingers grabbing at my sleeves, no parent emails about why their kid got paint on their uniform. Just me and miles of dirt paths winding through the trees. That Saturday in early April, I'd set my alarm for 5:30 to hit Pine Creek Gorge, this massive canyon about an hour north that locals call the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon. The northern trailhead parking lot only had 2 other cars when I pulled in around 7 that morning, which meant I'd have the trail mostly to myself. Perfect hiking weather too, about 50 degrees, clear sky, everything still damp from overnight rain that made the whole forest smell alive and earthy. My pack had all the usual gear: 3 liters of water, homemade granola bars, basic first aid supplies, pepper spray on my hip, phone with a portable charger. The plan was to do this 12-mile loop I'd hiked probably 15 times before, be back at my car by 3, then grab a beer and burger at this place in town that did trivia nights. About 3 miles in, right when the trail starts climbing toward the ridge overlook, I caught this thin column of smoke rising through the trees maybe 200 yards to my left. Not forest fire smoke, too contained for that. More like a campfire, except there weren't any campsites in that section. The smell hit me next, this weird mix of burning herbs and something sharp, almost chemical. Should have ignored it, kept moving, but I started thinking maybe some inexperienced hikers were lost or in trouble. Pushing through the underbrush wasn't easy. Lots of thorny bushes and low branches that kept snagging my pack. The ground was muddy and covered with last fall's leaves, making every step slippery. As I got closer, I could hear voices, low and rhythmic, almost like chanting, but not quite. Through the trees, I finally saw them. 5 men sitting in a rough circle around a small fire. They all looked to be in their 40s or 50s, wearing regular hiking clothes, but somehow seeming completely out of place. Each one had a piece of wood in their hands, maybe 8 inches long and thick as a broom handle, and they were using pocket knives to carve something into them. The way they moved was synchronized, like they'd practiced this exact thing 100 times before. Their voices overlapped in this monotone mumbling that didn't sound like English or Spanish or any language I recognized. The one facing my direction had this shaved head with a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon above his left ear, and he was the first to notice me. His eyes locked onto mine instantly, pale gray eyes that didn't blink, didn't show surprise, didn't show anything really. He kept carving while staring right at me, and one by one, the others turned their heads to look too. Nobody said hello. Nobody asked if I was lost. Nobody acted like normal people would when a stranger stumbles onto their campsite. The man directly across from the bald one had this thick red beard with gray streaks and was wearing a faded green jacket with duct tape patches on the elbows. To his left sat a younger guy, maybe 30, with acne scars covering his cheeks and a weird tattoo of what looked like tree roots climbing up his neck. They all just kept carving and staring, and I realized the symbols they were cutting into the wood weren't random. They were deliberate patterns, almost like letters, but not from any alphabet I knew. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt," I managed to say, taking a step backward. My voice came out higher than normal, and I could feel sweat forming on my palms despite the cool morning. The bald one with the birthmark tilted his head slightly, like a dog hearing a strange noise, but didn't respond. Instead, he lifted the piece of wood he'd been carving and held it up toward me. The symbols he'd cut were deep and precise, 3 interlocking triangles with a spiral in the center, and below that, something that looked like a stick figure but with too many arms. The smoke from their fire kept drifting toward me, making my eyes water, and that sweet metallic smell was getting stronger. I noticed they had a metal bucket next to the fire with some kind of liquid in it, dark and oily, and every few seconds one of them would dip their carved stick into it. The fourth man, who I hadn't gotten a good look at before, stood up slowly. He was massive, probably 6'4", wearing a brown canvas jacket that looked like it hadn't been washed in months. His hair was long and greasy, tied back with what appeared to be a shoelace, and he had these deep-set eyes that were so dark they looked black. He didn't walk toward me exactly, just took a few steps to the side, and that's when I realized the fifth man had also stood up and moved in the opposite direction. They were spreading out, not aggressively, but deliberately, like they were trying to form a wider circle. The younger one with the neck tattoo started humming, this low, droning sound that the others picked up one by one until all 5 were doing it. My brain was screaming at me to run, but I tried to play it cool, gave them an awkward wave, and said something stupid like, "Well, have a good hike," before turning around and walking back toward the undergrowth, forcing myself not to run because somehow that felt important. Getting back through the bushes seemed to take forever, every snapping twig under my feet sounding like a gunshot. Once I hit the main trail, I picked up my pace, not quite jogging but definitely speed walking. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and I kept glancing back every few seconds. Nothing. Just trees and empty trail. After about 5 minutes, I finally let myself breathe normally, and even laughed a little at how paranoid I was being. They were just weird guys doing some strange ritual thing, probably some New Age nature worship group or something. But then I heard it, a branch breaking somewhere behind me, maybe 50 yards back. Then another. The sounds were spaced out, deliberate, like someone trying to maintain distance but definitely following. I pulled out my phone to call 911 but had no signal, which wasn't unusual for that part of the gorge, but felt particularly awful right then. I knew the trail well enough to know there was a park ranger station about 2 miles ahead, right where the loop trail intersects with the Blue Blaze trail that goes down to the creek. 2 miles. I could do 2 miles. I started actually jogging now, not caring if they knew I was scared. The footsteps behind me picked up too, and then I heard that humming again, but louder, coming from multiple directions. They weren't all behind me anymore. Some had gone around through the woods and were moving parallel to the trail. I could catch glimpses of movement through the trees, a flash of that green jacket here, the tall one's brown canvas there. They were keeping pace with me easily, and I realized they knew these woods way better than I did. The worst part was when the humming would stop for a few seconds, and all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and their footsteps getting closer, spreading out wider, like they were hurting me somewhere specific. My legs were burning, and my pack kept bouncing against my back, throwing off my balance. Up ahead, I saw a fallen tree blocking part of the trail. Huge thing. Probably came down in a storm, with its root system torn up and creating this wall of dirt and tangled roots about 8 feet high. I had to slow down to climb over it, and that's when the bald one appeared on the trail behind me, maybe 30 feet back. He wasn't running, just walking with this steady, measured pace, still carrying that carved stick. His gray eyes never left mine as I scrambled over the tree, my hiking boots slipping on the wet bark, my knee slamming hard into a branch. Behind him, I could see the younger one with the neck tattoo emerging from the trees, and he had something in his hand. Looked like a rope or cord made from stripped bark, twisted and braided together. The ranger station had to be close, maybe another half mile. I dropped down the other side of the fallen tree and immediately felt a sharp pain in my ankle. Must have landed wrong. But adrenaline is one hell of a drug, and I kept moving, limping but still faster than walking. The trail curved ahead, and I remembered there was a steep section with wooden steps built into the hillside. If I could get there first, maybe I could gain some distance. But when I rounded the curve, the tall one in the brown jacket was standing at the bottom of the steps, just waiting. He had positioned himself perfectly. I couldn't go forward without going through him, and I could hear the others closing in behind me. To my right was a steep drop-off into a ravine, probably 40 feet down to a rocky creek bed. To my left, thick undergrowth and thorns. The humming had stopped completely now, replaced by this horrible silence where I could hear my own pulse thundering in my neck. That's when I remembered the pepper spray on my belt. My fingers were shaking so bad I almost dropped it, but I managed to flip the safety tab off and held it out in front of me, switching my aim between the tall one ahead and checking behind me. The bald one had stopped about 20 feet back, and the others were spread out in a semicircle, all holding those carved sticks like they were precious. The tall one took a step forward, and I just started spraying wildly, screaming at the top of my lungs. Not words, just this primal sound I didn't know I could make. The spray caught him right in the face, and he stumbled backward, hands going to his eyes, making this awful choking sound. I didn't wait to see what the others would do. I charged right at him while he was blinded, shoulder-checked him hard as I passed, and took those wooden steps 3 at a time, my twisted ankles screaming with every impact. Behind me, I could hear shouting for the first time. Actual words, though I couldn't make them out over my own gasping breaths and the blood rushing in my ears. The ranger station came into view, a small brown building with a green roof, and I've never been so happy to see a government building in my life. I burst through the door like a madwoman, probably looked absolutely insane, covered in mud, bleeding from scratches I didn't remember getting, tears and snot all over my face, still clutching that pepper spray like a lifeline. The ranger, this older woman named Officer Garrett, took one look at me and immediately got on her radio. Within 15 minutes, there were 3 more rangers and 2 state police officers there. They searched for over 2 hours but never found the men. They did find the spot where the fire had been. The ashes were still warm, and there were those wood shavings everywhere, covered in symbols. The police took photos and samples of everything, especially that oily residue they'd left in the dirt. Officer Garrett drove me back to my car and followed me home to make sure I got there safe. I filed a full report, but nothing ever came of it. I still hike, but never alone anymore, and definitely never at Pine Creek Gorge. The trail that afternoon was supposed to be nothing more than a chance for me and my 2 friends, Lauren and Emily, to get away from classes and breathe a little. We had driven out early, parked near the visitor center, and packed light. Just some water, snacks, and a blanket we thought we'd spread out once we reached one of the overlooks. The kind of day where you don't expect much. Just trees, the crunch of gravel under boots, and conversations that wander as much as the path itself. By the time we reached the halfway point, we had already crossed paths with several other hikers, most of them couples or small families. There was only one person who stood out, a man walking alone, wearing a faded green windbreaker, carrying no visible backpack and keeping his hands tucked inside the pockets as if he didn't have a reason to use them. We stepped aside when he passed, offered the polite nod strangers give on the trail, and thought nothing of it. Hours later, the air had shifted. Shadows stretched longer across the dirt, and the temperature began to slip just enough that I pulled my hoodie tighter. That's when Emily, who was leading, stopped abruptly and turned her head toward me and Lauren. She whispered that the same man was ahead of us again, leaning against a wooden signpost as if he'd been waiting there. I brushed it off, telling myself he must have taken one of the shorter loops that reconnected with ours. But the uneasy silence between the three of us said we were all thinking the same thing. We slowed our pace, trying to keep conversation going, but it felt forced. The trees seemed louder than us, every rustle of leaves, every branch snapping under a squirrel's weight. When we reached the next bend, he was gone again, just vanished into the deeper part of the woods. We told ourselves it was fine, that people cross paths on trails all the time, but I caught Lauren chewing at her lip, eyes darting to the tree line. Something about the way he carried himself didn't match the easygoing rhythm of a casual hiker. At some point we reached a fork where the trail split, one side heading back toward the main loop and the other winding deeper into the forest. We chose the loop that would eventually lead us back to the parking area, and for a while, I convinced myself the unease was just nerves. But then, maybe 15 minutes in, the sound of boots striking gravel echoed from behind us. When we turned, there he was again. Same green jacket, same slow, deliberate walk, closing the distance without saying a word. Lauren suggested we stop for water, hoping maybe he'd pass and continue on. But instead he slowed too, hovering just far enough that he didn't overtake us. It felt intentional, like he wanted to keep us in sight but not close enough to start a conversation. Emily muttered that we should pick up the pace, and we did, but no matter how quick our steps got, his rhythm matched ours. The sun had dropped lower, streaks of orange fading behind the tree line, and every shadow stretched like it was chasing us. The further we went, the fewer people we saw. Earlier, the trail had felt busy. Dogs, kids, the occasional runner. But now it was thinning out until it was only us and him. We tried to act natural, laughing louder than we needed to, forcing small talk about dinner plans. But every time I glanced back, his figure was there. Not hurried, not casual, just steady, like he knew we'd eventually run out of daylight. When the woods grew dim, we agreed silently that we needed to cut through to the access road that led back toward the visitor center. Emily had the map on her phone, and even though service was spotty, she guided us off the main trail. The shift in terrain made our steps louder, crunching twigs and leaves, and I couldn't help but glance back every few seconds. The problem was, no matter which way we turned, he always seemed to appear again, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, as if he knew shortcuts through the forest that we didn't. By then, my nerves were raw. Every twig snapping under our boots sounded like it belonged to him instead. When we finally spotted the narrow access road through the trees, it felt like a lifeline. We pushed through the brush and stumbled onto the gravel, our breaths sharp and quick. For a moment, I let myself believe that was it, that the open space meant safety. But then, from further up the road, the green windbreaker stepped out from the tree line like he'd been waiting there the whole time. Emily swore under her breath, and Lauren grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. There weren't any other cars or hikers in sight, just the stretch of road leading back toward the parking lot. We didn't even bother talking. All three of us broke into a run. My lungs screamed. The straps of my backpack dug into my shoulders, and I could hear his footsteps pounding behind us, heavier than before. closing distance in bursts. The relief when the visitor center came into view is hard to explain. A ranger truck was parked out front, headlights still on, and 2 staff members were standing near the entrance. The second they noticed us sprinting, one of them called out. That was enough to stop him. When I turned back, he'd frozen in place at the edge of the tree line, watching. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the woods as if he'd never been there. We told the rangers everything, giving as many details as we could. The jacket, his height, the way he always reappeared. They sent another officer down the trails with a flashlight, but no one ever found him. To this day, I can't explain how he always managed to be ahead or behind us without us seeing him cut through. All I know is that I haven't set foot on a trail that's secluded since, and I doubt I ever will again. It was a fall break a few years back when my brother and I decided to get out of the city for a couple of days. He had just finished his first semester at a community college, and I was stuck in a dead-end retail job that left me restless most nights. We thought a quick hiking trip would be the kind of reset we both needed. The national park we picked wasn't one of those huge tourist traps. It was quieter, with long stretches of forest where you could walk for hours without hearing another person's voice. That solitude was exactly what drew us there in the first place. My brother's name is Daniel, and he's always been more adventurous than me. He has this way of convincing people, especially me, that just 1 more mile is no big deal. That morning, we had been following a marked trail with the usual colored blazes painted on trees. The leaves had started to turn, and the canopy above us filtered the sunlight in patches of amber and green. Everything felt calm. Almost too calm. Like the kind of peace you don't notice until it stretches on a little longer than you expect. Somewhere along the way, Daniel pointed out carvings on a cluster of pines just off the main trail. They weren't the official blazes. These looked more like someone had hacked at the bark with a hunting knife. The cuts were rough but deliberate, each one forming an arrow pointing deeper into the woods. It didn't look like vandalism. It looked like a system, as if someone had taken time to mark a path for others to follow. Daniel got that look in his eyes, the one that always meant we were about to do something dumb just for the thrill of it. I argued, of course. I told him we didn't know where it led, that it wasn't on the map, and that the sun would start dropping before too long. But he laughed, said we had plenty of daylight left, and started down the unmarked trail before I even gave an answer. I didn't want to be the boring older brother trailing behind, so I followed. At first, it felt exciting, like we were in on a secret no one else knew about. The forest grew thicker, quieter, and the air had this faint smell of damp earth and cedar that clung to my jacket as we walked further from the main path. The deeper we went, the stranger it felt. The official trails always had a certain look to them: trampled dirt, a few discarded water bottles, maybe even a bench or two at scenic spots. This one had none of that. The ground was soft and uneven, with roots jutting out like bones under skin. I noticed the arrows weren't random either. They always appeared right when the path seemed to fade, guiding us forward like breadcrumbs. Whoever made them didn't want anyone to turn back easily. It didn't sit right with me, but Daniel treated it like some kind of treasure hunt. After maybe an hour, the forest around us felt denser. The canopy blotted out most of the sky, and the sounds of the park, distant voices, the rush of a creek, had disappeared. What replaced them was silence, the heavy kind that makes your ears ring. That's when I realized I hadn't seen any animals for a while. Not a squirrel, not a bird overhead. Just us, walking deeper into a place that didn't feel like it belonged to the rest of the park anymore. At one point, we reached a clearing with an old tree stump in the center. The bark had been stripped off, and carved into the flat surface was the same arrow symbol we'd been following. Only this one was bigger, etched carefully like it was meant to be a landmark. Daniel touched it like he was impressed, but I felt a sharp unease. It wasn't a random shortcut. This trail was organized, intentional. Someone had gone through the effort of creating it, and that someone didn't want casual hikers to know about it. I told Daniel again we should turn back, but he shrugged me off and kept going. The arrows beyond that point grew rougher, almost rushed, but they still pushed us forward. I remember thinking how far we'd wandered because when I checked the time on my phone, more than 3 hours had passed since we left the main trail. No reception bars, of course. The air felt cooler, heavier, and even though the sun shouldn't have been setting yet, the woods seemed darker than they had any right to be. By the 4th hour, Daniel finally admitted we were lost. The arrows kept showing up, but instead of reassurance, they felt mocking. I tried to retrace our steps, but the forest looked the same in every direction. The air was damp, and I swear I could smell smoke somewhere far off, though there were no campgrounds marked in this section of the park. The deeper we walked, the more I felt like we weren't supposed to be there at all, like we'd stepped into a place that existed just outside the edges of the official map. We eventually stumbled across something that made my skin crawl. Another clearing, this one with a crude wooden structure leaning against a cluster of trees. It wasn't a shelter in the normal sense. It looked more like a blind someone would use for hunting, except it had carvings all over the planks. The same arrow shapes scratched over and over until the wood was scarred with them. Daniel tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't a random trail. It was built to funnel people here. That was the breaking point. I forced Daniel to agree that we needed to turn around, even if it meant backtracking blindly. We walked for hours, ignoring the arrows, heading whichever way the terrain sloped until we finally heard water. Following the sound brought us to a stream, and from there we managed to reconnect with a marked trail, just as the last light faded. I don't think I've ever felt relief hit so hard as when I saw that painted blaze again. To this day, I wonder who created that path. It wasn't some ranger's shortcut. There were no signs, no records, nothing on any map we checked afterward. The fact that the arrows led deeper and deeper instead of circling back is what unsettles me the most. Someone wanted strangers to follow, and they made damn sure the way out wasn't easy. We never told anyone at the park office. Part of me still regrets that, but another part is glad I didn't have to explain why 2 brothers followed a trail that was never meant to exist.